Let's look at methods in Java. You've already been working with the main method. Well, now we're going to define our own custom methods that we can also add to our file, and then we'll execute them in main. Take a look at this page out of your textbook, page 207. You'll see the definition of a method here. This is a generic method. You'll notice that there's a method header, one line, and then inside a set of curly braces, we have the method body. The method body could be one statement or hundreds of statements in certain cases. Let's focus on the method header line. First of all, notice public and static. We're going to be making all of our methods public and static. Static because we're going to be running these methods in main. And main itself is a static method, as you know, public static void main. Well, because main is static, in order to run a method inside main, the method has to be static as well. And so all of the methods you're going to create in Chapter 6 will be static. And by making them public, they're going to be accessible to other classes. So we'll go with public, static. Then you have the return type. Some methods have to return something back to main in order to do their job. If that's not the case, the return type could be void. Typically, there are two types of methods. You've got the void methods, which generally they print something out or change the value of something, but they don't return anything back to main. This particular method is return type int, and it's going to return the larger of two arguments that are passed to it. The name of the function is max, and we have two integers being passed to this method as formal parameters. So this method is going to look at two integer values. It's going to use an if and else block to determine which one is the larger, and it's going to return the larger, as you can see. Every statement that returns a value must have a return statement. Eclipse will let you know if you forget. It'll nag you to indicate that you must return a value, and you must return a value of type int in this particular case. Now, some methods will return a string. Some methods could return a double. We'll even return arrays when we do Chapter 7. Not all methods require parameters. So sometimes the parentheses will be empty when you define a method. Just depends on what the needs are, what the purpose of the method is. In this particular case, in order to find the larger of two numbers, obviously we have to know what those two numbers are. So we're going to pass those into the method inside the parentheses so that the method can work on those values. Let's take a look at an actual program here in Eclipse. Here's a program, I called it methods 1. It's got a main method, as you can see up here. Let's just ignore that for the time being and focus down here on this method. Now, notice that this method, notice where it's defined. It's outside of main, but it's still inside the class called methods 1, but outside of main. It's below the closing. There's the closing brace for main, and we're below that. Notice the method header, public static void. Rect area is the name of the method, and we're giving it two integers to work with, x and y. Each one of those has to be typed, by the way. Just int x comma y would not work. It has to be int x, int y. Now what we're going to do is multiply the two of those together and store that in a variable called area. And then we're going to print out this statement showing what the area is. And that's a typical use of a void method. A void method often prints something out or changes the value of a variable in some way. Okay, but it's a void method. It does not have a return statement. It's not returning anything back to main. Now, let's look up at main for a second. Here's where I'm going to use that method. First of all, I'm going to specify two variables, len and width, with values of 12 and 4 respectively. And then here's the method call. You'll notice that Eclipse italicizes it for you. So when we're calling the method, we call it by its name, and we have to give it two arguments to work with, when we actually use the method here, we call these arguments. When we call the method, that's the lingo that's used for running a method, is you call the method. And this method is a void method. It's going to print something out. So when we run this, we're going to see something printed out in our output, which we'll look at in just a moment. Okay, well, actually, I'll run it. And then I'll just modify the screen a little bit. And unfortunately, it's a little bit small, but there's the output of line 8 up above. That is the execution of the rect area method. It's a void method. It prints something out. It's printed out by this line here inside the method. So what happens is when Java encounters this line in the code, it looks for a method called rect area in the file. When it finds it, it executes the code inside. The variable len gets passed into the parameter x. The variable width gets passed into parameter y. Now let's look at the next method. We've got another method down here. This one is a method that's going to return a value, but you'll notice once again it's public static, but instead of being void, this one is int. This one is going to return an int. And this one is called return area, is the name of the function, or method, I should say. Methods are like functions in other languages. And it's going to take two parameters again for x and the y. And this time we're going to return the two values. We're not printing anything out. We're going to multiply them and return the product back to main. So this is a value returning method, the other main type of method. Now let's look at how we can use that. Here it is up in main. Here's where we're using it up in main. We call it by name, return area, and we give it the two values again to work with. But look, when we call this, because it returns a value, we've got to catch that value in some way. And because I know it's returning an int, I'm going to catch it in a variable called area up here, a variable called area, which is of type int. So when the program runs, when Java encounters this line, it hops down here, it looks for that method called return area. When it finds it, it executes this code down here, which tosses a value back to main, which we have to catch in a variable, and then we can print that out, which is what we're doing here in line 13. Another alternative, when you're returning a value, is you can actually use the return value as part of a print statement itself. You can embed it, and here it is. I've embedded the method call right inside the print line, and because that returns an int, that will be replaced by the return value when we call this, and it is in fact 48, as you can see down below. So you have two options when you have a method that returns a value. You can catch it in a variable, and that's what you'll want to do, of course, if you want to do some more coding with that variable. Obviously, that's the way you have to go. If you simply want to output that variable, well, you could embed it in a print statement, as we're showing here. Okay, so that's a little bit of an introduction to methods. They're not difficult at all. Just have to remember, always public and static. Then you choose your return type. If it's not returning anything, it's type void. Choose a name, and then if the method needs some values to work with, those are the parameters, and you define the parameters inside the parentheses and type them. You have to specify what type they are, of course. And Bob's your uncle.